as I said a minute ago, we want to spend the first few minutes of our time together looking at the prophet Elijah. And the background that we first find out about Elijah in 1 Kings 17. So we're going to look at 1 Kings 16 through 17, just really quickly, give you a few minutes to process it, and then we'll turn it over to Joaquin. So the background of the story of Elijah is this is all taking place when King Ahab is on the throne. And if you read the book of Kings, Ahab is just the last in a long, dramatic downward spiral. In fact, when the Bible talks about his father Omri, it says that he was the worst king so far. He did more evil than all of those who were before him. And then when Ahab is born and takes over from his father, we found out that Ahab is even worse. So Omri is the worst king yet, and then Ahab, his son, beats him at badness. And this badness basically has to do with idolatry. And so we read in 1 Kings 16:31 to 33 that this is about Ahab, as if it had been a light thing for Ahab to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. And Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So Ahab marries Jezebel, the daughter of a king who rules over a place where they're really into worship of Baal, a pagan god in the neighborhood around Israel. And Ahab brings Jezebel here to Israel, and when he does that, he sets up an altar for Baal, this pagan god. He sets up a temple for the altar in the house of Baal right there in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and he worships Baal, and all Israel participates in that idolatrous worship with him. And if you're reading the story of the Old Testament, you might ask yourself a question like, why Baal worship? Why would Israel get into Baal worship? When I was a kid and I read this story, I always pictured somebody like coming and like knocking on the door and passing out like an evangelistic tract for Baal worship, or maybe like they had really good arguments for why Baal was the supreme deity or something. Or maybe they really like Baal statues, although you can see from my PowerPoint, that's a statue of Baal, not all that pretty. Don't really see what the big deal is with Baal worship. But here's the deal. Around in the neighborhoods, in the communities around Israel, Baal was called the rider on the storm clouds. He was a god whose primary promise was that he could bring the rain and the dew and make the crops grow. So in the stories that the nations around Israel told about Baal, when Baal was not worshipped properly or when he was absent, the crops failed, pregnant women would fail to give birth, livestock would die, because without Baal, there could be neither rain nor dew. But, so these pagan worshipers said, when Baal did show up, he brought the thunder. So he's the rider on the storm clouds, and he would appoint the time of his rain, and he would make his voice ring out in the clouds and flash his lightning to the earth. And then it was like party time, because the heavens would rain oil and the rivers would run with honey. So the reason why Israel turns to the Baals is not primarily about pretty statues or a good apologetic argument. They turn to Baal because Baal made an economic promise, right? He promised that he could deliver the goods. And before we're too hard on the Israelites on turning to Baal, we need to remember some facts about what it would be like to be an Israelite farmer. This green picture here is a picture of the Valley of Jezreel during the rainy season in Israel. So this is what it looks like in Israel when the rains come on time and when it's sort of harvest season. This picture down here is the exact same area when it's not the rainy season, when the rains are not falling. And this picture shows what drought might look like in the land of Israel. So once we recognize that in Israel, unlike in Egypt or some of the other countries around Israel, they are all farmers, 100% they're farmers, and their farms are completely dependent on the rain. They don't have big rivers like the Nile in Egypt or some of their communities. So if it doesn't rain, people literally die. And we estimate that 3 or 4 years out of every 10 in Israel would have been bad years. There would be crop failure. The rains would come too early or too late or not enough 3 or 4 times out of 10. And that means that there was real hardship and suffering when the rains didn't come. And in fact, every century or so, Israel probably experienced the kind of famine where people were literally dying for lack of food. So from that perspective, if you think about the Israelites, when Baal comes to town, they don't stop worshiping Yahweh the Lord, but they do add Baal to the mix. They add Baal like an insurance policy, because if you are utterly dependent on rain for your survival, and your neighbors tell you that this God can deliver the rain, you can understand, and at least I can understand, the temptation to add Baal to my religious mix to try to secure my economic well-being. And that's really what Ahab's idolatry and Israel's idolatry is all about. The problem is that Baal worship is costly. Just before Elijah arrives on the scene, we're told that in Ahab's days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho at the cost of his firstborn and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub. And Bible scholars think that this probably refers to Hiel offering his sons as sacrifices, child sacrifice, to Baal in order to gain political and economic power. Jeremiah makes this explicit. This is the prophet Jeremiah. He says, from the earliest times, our worship of that shameful god, Baal, has taken away what our ancestors worked for. It has taken away our flocks and our herds and even our sons and daughters. Baal worship, in other words, idolatry, makes a promise, but it costs the people who embrace that idolatry dearly. And so in the story of Elijah that we come to in 1 Kings 17, the true God, Yahweh, goes toe-to-toe with the pretender, Baal, through his prophet Elijah. The story of Elijah is about Yahweh, the true God, confronting the pretender idol Baal that was enticing God's people, going toe-to-toe with him through the prophet Elijah. And so God, through Elijah, strikes at the two main claims that Baal would make. So on the one hand, Elijah strikes at the very heart of Baal worship by sending a drought. So think about this. Israel has just said, we're going to worship Baal because he's the guy who can make sure it rains so we don't have drought and famine. 1 Kings 17:1 says, Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to King Ahab, as certainly as the Lord God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain in the years ahead unless I give the command. Elijah shows up and says, you just sold your soul to secure the rain, but actually there will be none except by my word, says Elijah, because I am the prophet who stands in the presence of Yahweh, the true God. And secondly, Elijah not only denies that Baal can deliver the goods, God demonstrates through Elijah that Yahweh can deliver the goods. So this is 1 Kings 17:2-6. The Lord told Elijah, leave here and travel eastward. Hide out in the Kerith Valley near the Jordan. Drink from the stream. I've already told the ravens to bring you food there. So he did as the Lord told him. He went and lived in the Kerith Valley near the Jordan. The ravens would bring him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he would drink from the stream. This is really incredible. There's a drought that God has brought, and yet God provides for his prophet by showing him a stream where water is still flowing, and by sending him bread and meat daily, miraculously, through these ravens that bring him food, right? And what's happening here is God is saying, not only can Baal not deliver the goods, but I can deliver the goods, and I can deliver the goods with an abundance that you cannot imagine. Because in the ancient world, nobody except a king would eat meat every single day. Meat was very rare in the typical Israelite diet. Only a king would eat meat every day. And even he would be lucky to get meat twice a day. So God's not just providing for Elijah, he's providing for him royally. He's giving him a feast in the wilderness, as it were. And so this is the picture. God's people tempted towards idolatry to secure their own needs out of desperation. And God showing up in Elijah saying, not only can Baal not deliver the goods, but my plan is to give you all that you need, and I can do it because I am the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I am the one who controls the world and all its weather. And I will bless and protect and care for my people who remain faithful to me. That's what this first story of Elijah is all about. And so I want to give us a minute and think about how might this story challenge us today. So I want to give you just 5 minutes to share in those same breakout groups your thoughts on these three questions. These three questions. Where are the things you turn to besides God failing you? Where are the things you turn to besides God failing you? What is like the Baal in your life that's not delivering the goods? That's the first question. And the second question, how are you experiencing God generously taking care of you in this season? How are you experiencing God providing for you like he provided for Elijah? And then third, what would it look like for you to worship and trust God alone in this time? Take a few minutes in those same breakout groups. I'll let you know when you need to come back and just discuss those three questions for a moment.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about some of the economics of the pandemic. As we all know, pandemic poses a serious threat to human well-being. That should be the main concern, right? So even though this is about economics, in the end, the economy is there to people, not the other way around. So it's a threat to well-being, economic activity, and it poses great challenges for both economic and health policy. And so what I want to say is provide a brief overview of the several sectors, demographic groups that are likely to be affected by the crisis, and how it translates into aggregate effects for the whole economy. Something that I want to emphasize today is that there's distributional consequences of this crisis, right? It's not going to affect everybody the same way, with something that we've observed. So I want to emphasize that. And this is not a comprehensive treatment. It's just, it's just a set of thoughts, some mine, some that I borrowed from colleagues. And I think this is something that can be a guide for people who are interested in keeping track of information. Right. So we're constantly bombarded with information, and so it's good to have a guide about what to look for and what to dismiss and what to pay attention to. And I will focus mostly on the U.S. And I'm going to talk a little bit about policies as well. And something to keep in mind, this is debatable and it might be a little bit controversial, but health and economic policies have to be evaluated in terms of expected costs and benefits, both short and long term. So, and that's something that we can talk for days about this, but we won't, I promise. So just a brief kind of tutorial. Some like the very economic principles of the pandemic is there's this thing called externalities, right? Which is when we do something for which we're not fully either compensated or fully reprimanded, then we say there's an externality. We don't pay the cost of our actions. And why is there an externality in this case? Because private actions, in this case, action are not enough, right? The most obvious externality in this case is that you can get others sick. and you can get others sick but not showing symptoms. And the less obvious is that if you get sick without infecting others, you can contribute to the scarcity of ventilators. So in these cases, government intervention is necessary to reduce these externalities. So a classic example of an externality in a different context is something like secondhand smoking, right? Smoking, it affects you as an individual if you choose to smoke, but it also affects other people who are not engaging in that activity. So that's another example of an externality. Okay, to keep things in order. So this is a timeline of what this crisis looks like. So there's an epidemic that requires a health policy. That health policy produces an economic shock, which requires economic policy. And then there's going to be short-term and long-term outcomes based on all these events. So the first is not what is causing the shutdown of economic activity, right? The reason we have a shutdown or a lockdown is because we're trying to give the healthcare system a break, right? We don't want to overwhelm the healthcare system. So this has led to containment measures. Some of them started even before the government provided any guidance, right? There's data that shows that individuals responded to the news about deaths, for instance, and started exercising social distancing measures by themselves before federal government guidance. This to economic activity puts a tremendous strain on business, and the end is past employees. And we already seen the unemployment figures. The millions of workers have been laid off, furloughed, or experienced reduced hours. And production chains are also being disrupted by this pandemic because moving goods across borders is harder now. So there are many activities that are going to be affected more than others, right? So the classic example that we've seen so far, movie theaters, restaurants, beauty shops. But if you think about it, there are many activities that are affected well, right? So just to think about two simple examples. Who's thinking of hiring a graphic designer right now? Businesses, are not in a full capacity, so probably they're passing on this hardship to all other parts of their business operation, and that includes hiring of other services, right? The same goes for like buying cars. Like, who wants to get in a car with a stranger right now? Work this, and I'm gonna expand on this a little bit later. Okay. This is also going to be hard for people who are either self-employed or in the informal sector because they have less access to safety nets. So what types of policy responses have we? So the Fed was very aggressive. The Federal Reserve, that's the U.S. Central Bank, they were very aggressive very early, even before there were any sort of social distancing measures. The Fed cut rates to nearly zero. And then they started doing something that is called quantitative easing, where they basically purchase treasuries and mortgage-backed securities with the intention of providing liquidity to the economy. Now, monetary policy has the advantage that it can be very quickly implemented, and this is something we've seen already. Unfortunately, it is also a very blunt instrument, right? Because if people are not consuming, they're not buying things, it doesn't matter how low you drive those interest rates if people are still not going out and spending money. So conventional policies are likely to fall short in a crisis like this. Now, something that has been happening more recently is that the Fed opened this municipal lending facility and they're starting to lend money to local governments. This might have a bigger impact, especially if they expand that new instrument. In times like this, the type of policy that is most effective is fiscal policy. So what we observed so far, like the stimulus package, that would be considered fiscal policy. The problem with fiscal policy, as we've seen, is that it can be very slow, right? If it's not enough, and if it's been done at a slow pace, it might not be effective. Even the ideal policy in terms of its impact. So now let me talk about the distributional aspects of the crisis. So what are the groups most affected? So this is not going to affect everybody the same. So the groups most affected are service sector workers, people in retail, construction, maybe not so much, but mostly people in low-wage occupations who probably have very low levels of benefits. Now, high earnings workers are more likely to be able to work from home, so they may suffer less in terms of financial stability. But there's also long-term consequences, right? So think about education and human capital formation. We have a lot of teachers in London Church, so you know what I'm talking about. Schools are either canceled entirely or trying to go online. So that means that we're relying more on the parental input, right? And on technology. So poorer kids without access to the right technology or to educated parents are gonna pay a higher cost for this pandemic, right? So we already have, we have evidence from what happened during Katrina, and that the amount of school loss because of Katrina had a much larger impact on poorer kids than on richer kids. And then the other obvious aspect is that schools provide meals for thousands of low-income kids. So that, there was some response to that. I don't know how widespread it was, but people realized some of these consequences. Now, essential services workers, they still have to show up for work, but there's no daycare or school, right? And in the case of low-wage essential workers, they face greater risk, but they don't face an increased compensation because they don't really have a credible outside option, right? Because the labor market is already pretty thin. In normal times, we usually think of risky occupations as those that carry a wage premium, but that's not the case. All of a sudden, being like working at a grocery store became a high-risk occupation, but we didn't see an increase in wages for that occupation. So as I'm sure all of you know, household production has become more prominent during these times. If you try to get a bread making machine in Amazon, you basically can't, right? It's sold out. But again, richer households can endure the crisis better. They can stockpile more, they can buy better food and other essential supplies they don't have to go out as much. And supporting people who struggle to make ends meet in regular times will face increased hardship. And something that is important is that a lot of community ties are going to be disrupted as well. Renters are also more likely to face hardships compared to homeowners. And like I said, in the end, this is about human well-being, right? So we're going to see, and we've seen already increased incidents of alcoholism and drug use, crime, domestic violence. All right. So remember, I said low-income households are more likely to be the most affected. Why? Because first, low-income households are likely to be overrepresented in the two categories that are most affected by this. First, they're more likely to be essential workers who face increased health risk without a higher pay. There are some more likely to be non-essential workers who cannot perform their jobs from home and thus will become unemployed. They also have less access to means to smooth out this crisis, right? So they don't have access to regular lending. So most of the type of access to credit they have is to predatory credit, which is not a good thing. And then, to put this in a more recent context, partial reopening means many low-income workers will not have the option of unemployment insurance and will have to return to work without real improvements in our control of the pandemic. To me, that's the most scary part, that we're reopening the economy and we haven't improved one bit in our ability to handle the virus, right? Nothing really has changed. We're opening just because we can't take it anymore, basically. Businesses can't take it anymore, so we're basically taking a big gamble here. Okay, so now some hard to swallow data. So that's per 100,000 population within group, and this is for the 38 states that report deaths by race plus the District of Columbia. So 21 per 100,000 population for all Americans in this sample. 14 white, 16 Latino, 37 Black, and this is per 100,000 Black individuals, right? It's not as a whole. It's just an Asian 16. So this is very worrisome. And then I'm gonna give you another one that is very worrisome. This is so in this scatter plot, the way you should think about this, so we have on the horizontal axis, we have Black share of the population for each of these states, and then in the axis of COVID deaths, right? So if this was a proportional representation based on population, all these states should be right on top of this line. But they're not. They're all way above, right? So for instance, Tennessee, roughly 17% of the Tennessee population is Black, but 32% of the COVID deaths are Black individuals. In the case of DC, it's ridiculous. They're 44% of the population and 8% of all COVID deaths. So it's not affecting everybody the same way. And I didn't have time to check the age distribution. And I'm sure it's going to be very different. I don't know, but I can safe conjecture that it's going to be very different. There's a lot more younger Black individuals that are dying compared to whites. And underlying conditions, and that may very well be the case, but it's also about the occupational distribution, right? And it's related to what we were talking about earlier. If you look at the occupational distribution by race, Blacks are more likely to work in occupations that are either essential or are high exposure in general. So what can the government keep doing is really just expediting what they have been doing and expanding the size and scope of what they've been doing. So cash transfers, I prepared this a few weeks ago, so some of these things already happened, but I think still they have to increase that. There's a bunch of micro policies. So policies aimed directly at helping households such as SNAP and Medicaid, housing assistance. All those policies can be expanded. But for that, the federal government really needs to help out local governments. So that's the big next step in terms of, and I'm not talking about health policy because that's not my area. Obviously, big step is spending money on the healthcare system, especially on testing. But outside of that, it's really helping out local governments. In a gradual reopening of the economy is, that's fine. It should be a part of a plan, right? Eventually we want to go back to normal. But for that, we really need our healthcare system to be in good shape and be able to handle testing, massive testing, which we don't have right now. So we're already reopening and we don't have massive testing. And that's what I have. I have some. I'll be happy to share these slides. I can send them to Michael so he can post them. These are some good sources if you want to keep track of information. But I'll send the slides to Michael. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Let's give Joaquin a round of applause. I don't know if you won't be able to hear us, but you can see us cheering you. I found that extremely helpful. It was really fun to feel like I was back in econ class, figuring out how the world actually works. So thank you for that, like super informative. I know I have lots of questions. I think the best way to do that, to take questions, is for people to type them in to the chat box, and we'll just get to as many as we can with the time that we have allotted. Is that okay with you, Joaquin? You okay with that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's
okay, great. So I've already got one question from Abigail. Do you know what the impact has been on the homeless population, either existing homeless population or on, has it affected rates of homelessness, the pandemic?
That's a great question. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know. That's one statistic I have looked at, but I will look at it because it's important.
Yeah, and maybe on that,
if you think about places where you rely mostly on shelters, it's got to be tough, right? It's got to be tough because it goes against what we've been told we should do. So shelters is probably, they're having a hard time with this.
Are there, when you think about addressing a question like that, Joaquin, and you don't know in this pandemic, you mentioned Katrina. Are there other parallel data sets that economists look at to help us make conjectures about what might happen?
Yeah, well, in the case of the homeless population, it's just I haven't looked at what people have been doing regarding that. It's more my ignorance than availability of data. I'm sure there's data. I just haven't looked at it.
Okay.
Yeah. So so this is a great question that I wanted to talk about. What can we do on a micro level to lessen the impact? I would say spend it locally, but like truly locally. If you're gonna spend your money, spend it on local businesses, and especially if you have some sort of informal informal connection, like for instance, like we have a guy who does who does our yard work, and he's completely informal, like he doesn't have a job, right? And we've been hiring him because he relies on that income, so we're still doing that, of course, that sort of thing. So don't spend all your stimulus check on Amazon, right? Spend it on Aldo's Pizza or something like that, like we've been doing. That's what I would do. And something that's economists call this risk sharing, and it might be a little bit extreme, but if you're in a position to do it, you should, is pay for things even if you're not actually getting those things, right? So we paid for one whole month of daycare without having daycare. To help our teachers. And obviously there's a stretch to how much you can do that, but to the extent that you can, that's something, that's something that can be done. So that's what I think can be done to help on a micro level.
I have a follow-up question to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
What about like places that are closed right now? Like if we wanted to buy a bike from a local bike shop or something, but the bike shop's closed, would you recommend kind of waiting till things start to reopen?
Yeah, for sure. Because they're gonna need people, they're gonna need people to come in and buy stuff when they reopen. Yeah. And if you can probably call them, figure out if you can reach the owner and tell them, hey, I wanna buy a bike. So I know I don't bike, but I play guitar, right? And the local shops, they're taking in phone orders, like, some of them, they even bring stuff to your house.
Joaquin, I know that a bunch of the charitable institutions that serve struggling populations, and even like Christ Community, which is offering testing and stuff, are doing some pretty serious fundraising. Strictly from an economic perspective, like what's the difference between like writing a check? Does giving to those charitable organizations lessen the ultimate economic impact of the stimulus money, or does it all come out in the wash?
So I don't know if they're having special provisions for during the crisis, but those, like most charitable giving, whoever is the facilitator takes a big cut of the contributions, and it's not negligible. It's like big. We're talking about up of 30%. So yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not big on these like big institutionalized, like mass scale mechanisms, but I think in the end, if you do a little bit of research, you can find ways to help locally. And right now, in the end, if you look at the way this has been handled, local governments are being left to their own devices pretty much to figure out how to handle this. So, we kind of have to stay local if we want to help.
Yeah, and we've got a question about that, Joaquin, from Brian. Brian's asking about the pushback from the federal government on local governments requesting aid, and he's asking, do you have any ideas for why that pushback is coming, and are there macroeconomic reasons for turning away from those more local micro policies?
There's no macro reason for this type of action by the federal government. I'm exaggerating, but no, there's no fundamental that's economic fundamental that says the federal government should let the states figure everything out. In the end, that's kind of the role of the federal government in instances like this is precisely to be this big facilitator of last resort, right? And for a lot of local governments, they're there already. Right? Local governments are forced to have balanced budgets, so they can only do so much, right? The local governments cannot. They have to have a balanced budget. So that's why what the Fed is doing right now, which is basically letting them borrow without having to pay back, is a big help for local governments, because they usually, in regular times, they don't have that cushion. But there's no reason, or there's no economics behind behind the pushback that the federal government is giving to local governments.
Okay, we've got two more questions, and that probably takes us to the end of our time. Kyle asked a question about biblical situations where God's people have to appear to choose between preserving life and sustaining economic stability. Joaquin, love to hear your thoughts on that. I would just say, I can't think of a perfect parallel, but if you look at the Old Testament, all of the economic legislation in the Old Testament is designed to balance human well-being with economic activity. So things like the sabbatical year, where you shut down formal economy for a year so that the land provides food for the orphan and the immigrant and the widow and the poor, is an example where God's people were called to severely curtail economic activity in the interest of human well-being. So that's one that comes immediately to my mind. Joaquin, love to hear any thoughts if you've got any other ideas on that one. And then love to hear this very, Josh, this is kind of an aggressive, Josh has asked you an aggressive question.
It's a great question. It's a great question.
Yeah. How do you as a Christian think about the balancing of these things? Yeah.
So the thing is, like, for me, there's no, like, this trade-off is not as sharp as they make it out to be, right? There's so many things that can be done without having to put it in those terms, right? And what I'm trying to say is, like, there might be like certain subset of the intellectual community that may want to lead you to think that there's an actual trade-off here, but I don't think there is, or at least it's not as clear cut as they want to make it be. So one thing that is important to keep in mind, though, is that this economic hardship can be translated into life-threatening situations down the road, right? That would be the way in which I think about. It's not clear cut that we're only comparing COVID-related deaths versus the economic activity. Economic hardship in itself has consequences on health, right? And that affects mortality rates as well. But in the end, I don't think there's it's not as clear cut as we may think, that is one or the other. That's my point. It's not one or the other. You can do both. You can save lives, and we can reopen part of the economy gradually. We can do both. Something that is, the problem is that it's hard, right? So these policies are hard to implement. The level of coordination required is too high, and the U.S. The problem is that the U.S. is a very big and very diverse population, and that makes it very hard to coordinate, right? So we often hear about comparisons to South Korea, right? Why aren't we doing what South Korea did? South Korea is a tiny country with a largely homogeneous population along many dimensions. So the coordination issues there are not as complicated as in a country like the U.S. Also, they have a better federal government. But yeah, so bottom line is, I think we can do both. At least that's how I approach this.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joaquin. I just want to say thanks again. It's really great to learn from your expertise, and just a reminder, a number of these Bible studies have reminded me of the passage in 1 Corinthians about each member of the body of Christ having gifts, and they give them for the upbuilding of all. So it's really great to have been able to hear you use those gifts tonight, and just hear about the research and thinking that you're doing. That's about all that we have time for. Again, I want to apologize for the tech problems early on my end. Next week, we're going to I believe Sergey is going to give us the next chapter in the Elijah story, and Adriana is going to be leading us in a worship night, I think. Is that right, Adriana? Yep, I see her nodding. And in the meantime, we'll see you at church on Sunday. And please, as always, let us know if you're struggling. Let us know how you're doing, if we can support in any way. Stay safe and healthy at every level. And love you guys, and can't wait to see you all face to face one of these days. So,
thank you.